So as far as my gaming exploits outside of the Steam Deck, I do tend to show the PS5 a lot of love on the console front. However, that being said, I also really like the Xbox. However, at this point, I think the Series X is really more of a Game Pass machine for me than anything, but that's alright because that's exactly what today's video is all about. Essentially how Microsoft is aiming to sort of rebrand Xbox and kind of decouple it from the idea of a console or box sitting under your TV or monitor, and instead turning it into this thing that sort of follows you around and makes sure those experiences are available wherever you happen to be playing, which includes the Steam Deck. But even though there are a ton of different games available on Game Pass, for the most part my Xbox mostly just collects dust unless some banger like Hi-Fi Rush comes out, so I'd kind of forgotten that yeah, if you're a Game Pass subscriber, there's a whole lot of potential there. And even though I keep Game Pass on my Steam Deck if I ever wanted to stream something from Xbox Cloud, I haven't really jumped into it since I just initially loaded it up last year just to make sure that yeah, it does indeed work. But in the course of redoing all of my emulators on the Steam Deck a couple of weeks ago, it really did bring Game Pass more sharply into focus because since I cleared all of the ROMs out of my non-Steam applications folder, now I kinda just had Game Pass staring me in the face, and I figured why not go ahead and jump in and really see what that experience is like and really give it a more thorough test of how well it performs on the Steam Deck and what the experience is actually like. And that's what today's video is all about. Now that I've had a chance to actually spend some quality time with Game Pass on the Steam Deck, today I just wanted to kind of go over what it's like to jump in, my experience playing different games, and a few deck-specific quirks that I noticed during my testing. So let's go ahead and start off with just jumping into Game Pass on the Steam Deck. So just firing up Game Pass on the Steam Deck, I sort of expected I would have a little bit of a rocky experience. Like I thought that my login would have expired, and it did, and I did have to log back in, but aside from just that initial login, everything loaded up really quickly, and in no time at all it was displaying the full gamut of Game Pass's offerings. And it was really easy to navigate that interface and see recent releases, or collections that have been kind of tailored to my tastes, I think, or just the entirety of the Game Pass library. And that was something that really surprised me too. For some reason I had it in the back of my head because I just don't dive into cloud streaming that much even when I'm on the Xbox. I thought that there was something like, maybe 40 or 50 titles or something in that range that you could actually just, comfortably stream to your console instead of installing it locally. But no, there's just a massive amount of games on offer here. I think somewhere in the range of like 400 or 500. So if all you ever did was just dive into Microsoft's gaming buffet, you definitely wouldn't go hungry. From the absolute latest releases like Atomic Heart to a bunch of quality indie titles, there's just so much on Game Pass at your disposal that lack of selection definitely isn't an issue. After getting over the initial hurdle of making sure that the app would launch okay and that I could get logged in and see that yeah, there are still a ton of games available on Game Pass, how was actually launching and playing those games? Well, there were two things that I was most concerned about. The first, obviously, is the video quality, because you're going to see a lot of stuttering or artifacting or that kind of grainy look that you see whenever you have like a lower bandwidth problem when streaming something from Netflix or YouTube. And the other thing that I was most concerned with was input lag. Now, I expect that there's going to be some amount of input lag. I mean, after all, you are playing from a cloud streaming service, but I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be so egregious that it would kind of knock the experience from a viable way to play to just like a passing amusement that I might indulge every now and then for testing or just to make a video like this. And on the visual front, I have to say it was pretty smooth for the most part. Now granted, this will largely be dependent on your internet connection and local network connectivity, but for me it performed really well. And I don't have any business class internet or some crazy like military grade Wi-Fi router or anything. I just have basic cable internet, and then on top of that I also have a Eero mesh Wi-Fi system I think that I got from Amazon. And again, so far I'd say it runs really well, just not totally flawlessly. A couple of times during my time with Atomic Heart while looking at the sky, I'd see that sort of video distortion effect, and sometimes textures would get that sort of checkered effect that you see when video streaming is trying to stabilize. But usually it only lasted for a few seconds, and the overwhelming majority of that time was good enough that I could legitimately forget for a second that I was streaming this game over the internet and not playing it locally off the deck. Now, I don't know that I'd want to play the most bleeding edge, like jaw-droppingly gorgeous AAA titles like this or anything, but if you've got a few minutes to spare and considering that, Xbox does automatically save all of your progress and make sure all that gets synced up okay and you've got a few minutes to kill, then, why not? And again, for the most part, it was totally playable. And I really did try to dive into a mix of games that range from more leisurely titles to twitchy action affairs that would require more precise timing. Admittedly, I would say that slower paced games are probably going to give you the best experience, but you can definitely play a twitchy action game in the vein of something like Ninja Gaiden and still perform pretty competently, even if there is a little bit of input lag. But if we're talking about less demanding titles that land somewhere in between a visual novel space and the most demanding action games, I'd say that's the sweet spot for cloud streaming from Game Pass. Don't get me wrong, everything has been playable so far, but at its most basic, I would say that slow and medium-paced games really shine the brightest, and of all the genres I sampled, turn-based RPGs seem like a particularly good fit, considering you've got plenty of time to think about your next action rather than say something like Wolong Fallen Dynasty where you really have to think about split-second timing. So it's easy to hop in and games load relatively quickly considering it is streaming over the internet and all, and I would say the performance is stable enough to definitely warrant some time with it on the Steam Deck. However, as much as I enjoyed it, there are a few quirks or things that I didn't quite like about the Game Pass experience on the deck, but first let's talk about some of the pros and things that I really liked about the experience. For starters, I would say one of the biggest advantages of playing Game Pass games on the Steam Deck is that it's a really great way to test games that you might buy for your Steam Deck natively in the Steam store. I found a ton of games on Game Pass that are either already in my Steam library, or ones that I was thinking about purchasing, some of which I've already featured here on the channel, like Atomic Heart, Chorus, Signalis, Coffee Talk, Deep Rock Galactic, like there's a ton of them. Again, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 titles, which means that Game Pass is still a pretty solid value in its own right if you're looking to have a ton of games at your disposal without, having to buy them all individually. And it's great for testing out games before deciding whether or not you want to buy a native copy on the Steam Deck, because one, you might find that playing on Game Pass is perfectly fine as is without the need to buy a native version, or two, you might also be curious to try a game on Steam, but then find that it doesn't have a demo available that you can jump into to get really an idea of what the full experience is like. For me, a personal example is Gungrave Gore. I'd never played a Gungrave game before, but was always curious, and I was thinking about buying this for the Steam Deck, but at $50 and no demo, this was a great way for me to sort of test it out and see if it'd be to my liking. Now granted, it wouldn't be a one-to-one comparison on the graphics front or anything, but it would at least give me a sense of what that gameplay was like, probably in a better way than just, watching a video review online. So if you also have a bunch of games that you're just curious to see what they're like before you plunk down some hard-earned dollars for it on Steam, it's definitely well suited to the purpose. Now putting testing aside, if you're just excited to jump into Game Pass already, one of the other great advantages of playing Game Pass games on the deck is you will get absolutely stellar battery life. Now if you try to play like some AAA visual stunner like Cyberpunk on the Steam Deck, in a lot of cases you're probably going to roast the battery in about an hour and a half, give or take. But if you're playing a game on Game Pass, which isn't really going to be taxing your GPU or draining your battery in any significant way, you can expect to get about 5 to 6 hours of playtime, and again, provided your connection remains strong, it can look really good on the Steam Deck. Something else I really appreciate about the Game Pass app is that the interface and navigation are nearly flawless. And it's clear that a lot of thought went into making sure that you can find your way around easily. I mean, it's basically a web page, so it's easy to navigate with either the touchpads on the deck or just using the analog sticks to jump around and make selections. And then when you're actually in a game, you can get to the Xbox guide easily by clicking or tapping on the dots on the side of the screen to pull up the guide. And it's really nice that they gave you the ability to sort of slide this guide around anywhere on the screen, so you won't have to worry about the Xbox guide accidentally covering up some part of the interface if you have a game that has a really busy HUD. However, while there's a lot going right here with the Game Pass experience on the deck, I did notice a couple of quirks in my time testing it. And one weird thing that I encountered is that sometimes when selecting a game to play, it would jump to the bottom of its information page, which was a little confusing at first until I realized I just needed to scroll up. And something else that I didn't catch initially when I started capturing footage was that if you're playing in docked mode, make sure that you launch Game Pass after you've already put the Steam Deck in docked mode. I didn't do this initially, so you might have noticed that the resolution was wrong in some of the captured footage here with a black border around the edges. And I'm pretty sure that's because undocked, the deck's resolution is 1200 by 800 with a 16 by 10 aspect ratio, where on a typical monitor, or in my case the capture card that I have the deck connected to, I have a 16 by 9 aspect ratio and a 1080p resolution. So if you launch Game Pass in handheld mode and then plug it into the dock, it will still work, but you will have the same borders at the top and bottom just like you would in handheld mode where, you're basically using a non-standard resolution. But if you do notice this happening while docked and have the borders, all you have to do is relaunch the Game Pass application and then it'll go back to a more standard aspect ratio, again, probably in 1080p. And again, these are just minor quirks and hardly showstoppers. However, what might be a showstopper for you really isn't something that's technically based around Game Pass, but something that I did consider based on my own personal playstyle. So if you're somebody like me who tends to just bounce around a ton of different games, or you get really into a game for a little bit, and then it kind of just, falls into your backlog, and you're like, ooh, I'll revisit this later. The only pitfall that I really see with Game Pass is that, games don't always stay on Game Pass forever. Like, I think the Microsoft first-party stuff does, but a lot of third-party games will stay on Game Pass for a while, and then after a number of months, they'll just not be available anymore. So it might be kind of a bummer if you start some really big action game that's like 40, 50 hours long or something like that, and then, you have to come back to it, a couple of months later, and then the game's no longer on Game Pass, then you're kind of stuck buying it if you want to make sure that you maintain your save progress. I feel like that's a pretty specific scenario that's largely rooted in your behavior as a player, but it is something that did occur to me. At the end of the day, I'd say if you're already a Game Pass subscriber, then putting this on your Steam Deck is a no-brainer, at least to test it out. And if you really do enjoy it, then it's kind of nuts and a little bit magical that you can enjoy like 400 or 500 games and just stream them to your Steam Deck with stellar battery life. Again, this is all assuming that you can stomach the occasional dip in quality and some noticeable but not egregious input lag. If those things aren't really a major concern to you, then yeah, you should definitely go ahead and put Game Pass on your Steam Deck because it's a whole lot of fun to mess around with. Now, if you're not already a Game Pass subscriber, do I think the value proposition is so strong that it justifies a $14.99 a month commitment? Maybe. I guess it really depends. If the Steam Deck is your only gaming machine, I'm not sure if I would say yes there, because really the only way that you can experience these games is to stream them, because you can't really install them locally, at least not natively in SteamOS. You might be able to do it if you dual booted Windows, but I haven't done that yet. But if you have a Steam Deck and an Xbox, I think that would definitely make it worth it, because again, you might stream a game and test it and be like, oh yeah, this seems like something fun that I want to play, but I want to see it in the absolute best quality. Then you can go ahead and install it locally on an Xbox and sort of be off to the races. So yeah, in a nutshell, I don't think there's a real clear answer on that. I think it's just a matter of preference. I think it's an excellent companion to the Steam Deck, but I don't know if it's enough of a draw on its own if that's your primary gaming platform to, again, justify plunking down that kind of dough to have access to only streaming these games. But hey, as usual, this is just one guy's opinion. What about you? Are you already a Game Pass subscriber? And if so, have you put it on the Steam Deck? If you're not already a Game Pass subscriber, but you play the deck frequently, is it enough of a value that you would consider picking it up if all you could do was stream those games? Would love to hear your thoughts on it. As always, thanks so much for taking the time to hang out here on the channel. It means a lot to me. Take care, and I'll see you next time.